Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Foreign Secretary has warned that there will be harsh consequences if Russia is found to have caused a mysterious illness, which is a former Russian double agent. Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia are both in intensive care after falling unconscious in Salisbury city centre on Sunday.
Well, police say they were exposed to an unknown substance and are carrying out investigations at a pub and a pizza restaurant in the city. Joe Tidy reports.
This CCTV footage is now a major focus in an international mystery. It's thought to show former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter moments before they fell critically ill. And it's here in Salisbury city centre that they were found unconscious. Multiple points of interest have been cordoned off in the shopping area. An Italian restaurant and local pub are also being searched. They're all believed to be places that the 66-year-old man and his 33-year-old daughter Yulia Skripal visited before they collapsed. Sergei Skripal was a double agent. He was arrested in Russia in 2004 for working for the British. He was convicted of treason. A Russian military court sentenced him to 13 years in jail.
Sergei Skripal is found guilty of state treason in giving out state secrets to representatives of foreign agencies.
But in 2010, Skripal became part of a major spy swap at an Austrian airport. He and 4 others who'd been found guilty of espionage were exchanged for Russian spies who'd been caught by the US. Skripal was allowed to move to Britain, where he's lived ever since. But now doctors say he and his daughter are in a critical condition.
The pair did not have any visible injuries and were taken to Salisbury District Hospital. They are currently being treated for suspected exposure to an unknown substance. This has not been declared as a counter-terrorism incident, and we would urge people not to speculate. However, I must emphasise that we retain an open mind and that we continue to review this position.
This was the scene last night, police taking no chances with full protective gear. 2 officers did need treatment, though, for minor symptoms. And if a poisonous substance is to blame, inevitable comparisons will be made with the case of Russian defector Alexander Litvinenko. He was murdered in 2006 using radioactive polonium. Despite extensive inquiries, the Kremlin refused to allow the chief suspects to be extradited to Britain, and relations between Moscow and London have never fully recovered.
I know members will have their suspicions.
This latest incident risks further tensions.
Is that if those suspicions prove to be well-founded, then this government will take whatever measures we deem necessary to protect the lives of the people in this country, our values and our freedoms.
The Russian government's been quick to offer assistance, but says it has no information about this new mystery incident. Joe Tidy, Sky News.
Well, let's take a look at what we know about Sergei Skripal's movements. The former double agent had been living in a relatively quiet life in Salisbury after moving there 8 years ago, following an extraordinary spy swap with Russia.
At around 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, he and his daughter Yulia were found slumped on a bench at the Maltings shopping centre in the city.
It's believed they'd been exposed to an unknown substance, and police closed a nearby branch of the pizza restaurant Zizi as a precaution.
They're also carrying out investigations at the Bishop's Mill pub in the Maltings, where a police cordon has been set up.
Skripal and his daughter were taken to Salisbury District Hospital, where they're now both fighting for their lives.
Well, Sky's Rebecca Williams is at the Maltings shopping centre in Salisbury and joins us now. Rebecca, what's the latest we're hearing?
Well, yes, this was the area where they were found on Sunday about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Yulia and her father, Skripal, were found just on a bench in the Maltings shopping centre behind me. As we know, they were rushed to hospital there, and later on, a serious incident was declared, and they had to shut the A&E department down while, work was carried out to try and improve the area and decontaminate it. Now, I went there yesterday lunchtime, and everything was back to normal, but we have got some more information coming out. According to her social media page, Yulia had been working in Southampton at the Holiday Inn there We also know that a number of emergency services workers were treated in hospital. All but one has now been discharged, and the hospital have told me that at least 2 of those were police officers. Those police officers have, like I say, now been discharged from the hospital, and they had minor injuries. But this is causing a lot of mystery here in this small city of Salisbury. We don't yet know what kind of substance the couple were subjected to. There are toxicology reports and investigations, examinations going on at the moment. We expect to get the results of that either later on today or at some point tomorrow. Interestingly, you can see behind me there are huge cordons in place here in Salisbury. Behind me, that's where the Zizi's pub is, and also further over the other side, that is where that pub is that's also been cordoned off. We understand they both went there before this incident happened. I've also incidentally been into the gym today. They say that the police are very interested in some CCTV, which shows 2 people walking through the underpassage at about 3:45 on Sunday. There is some suggestion that it could be the couple in question, and apparently the police had asked the gym to provide the identity of people using the facility between 3 and 4 o'clock. So there is a lot going on here. Wiltshire Police are leading this investigation, but they have had some assistance, and they are liaising with the counter-terrorism police. Like I say, the next key thing is to find out what kind of substance they were subjected to, but that's likely to come probably tomorrow, I would think now. Today's probably a bit too soon.
OK, Rebecca, thank you.
Well, counter-terrorism police are now involved in the investigation. With more on that, let's speak to our Home Affairs correspondent, Mark White. Mark, what can you tell us?
Certainly the indications that we're getting now from officials is that it is moving closer towards being treated as some kind of a criminal act, a deliberate poisoning, and even just listening to the Foreign Secretary in the Commons a little earlier, that certainly, although he wasn't willing to point fingers as such, he certainly went on with a very accusatory tone, pinning the blame in the direction, let's say that, of Russia. But we know that Counter-Terrorism Command are involved at the moment, counter-terrorism units from the southeast. One of our colleagues in Salisbury saw vehicles from the southeast counter-terrorism unit assisting those local officers in Salisbury, and they have a great deal of experience that they can bring to this investigation. Of course, the 2006 investigation into the murder of Alexander Litvinenko is a real case in point about just how tricky these inquiries are. In that particular instance, it was a radioactive substance, polonium-210, that was used to poison Alexander Litvinenko. But there are some key differences as well with that case and the case that we're looking at the moment. That radioactive substance was quite a slow-active or acting poison, in that it was really quite some days later before Alexander Litvinenko was incapacitated to the point that he had to be hospitalized. Whatever this was may well have been a very quick-acting substance, with both Mr. Skripal and his daughter Yulia incapacitated at the same time, perhaps quite quickly, which would lead investigators to look at the likes of that restaurant and that local pub that we know have been sealed off as well. One of the really positive aspects of this case, if it is a quick-acting substance that was used, means the police will have been onto it a lot quicker than they were in the case of Alexander Litvinenko. The trail is not as cold. They can examine those CCTV images, look for potential suspects who might still be in the country.
Mark, thank you.
Well, earlier, Boris Johnson suggested that if Russia was found to be involved in the incident, it could affect England's participation in the World Cup in Russia.
If things turn out to be, as many members, I think, on both sides, I suspect that they are, to return to that formula, I think we will have to have a serious conversation about our engagement with Russia. And for my own part, I think it will be very difficult to see how we can, thinking ahead to the World Cup this July, this summer, I think it will be very difficult to imagine that UK representation at that event could go ahead in the normal way, and we would certainly have to consider that.
Well, Sky's chief political correspondent John Craig is in Westminster. Is that going to scare the Russians? John, the fact that Boris might not be going to the football?
Well, it certainly caused a row here in Westminster because, of course, everybody's recalling back in 1980 when Margaret Thatcher tried to stop the British Olympic team going to the Moscow Olympics. Well, she failed in that, and of course that was the Olympic Games when Sebastian Coe ended up winning a gold in a dramatic showdown with his great rival Steve Ovett. So politicians meddling in World Cups and Olympic Games doesn't have a very happy history. Now, Boris Johnson was responding to a question from during that statement on the latest spy drama from the Labour MP Toby Perkins, who piece of parliamentary trivia for you, plays in goal for the MP's football team. Mr. Perkins tried to get some clarification immediately after the exchanges. Well, we have from sources close to the Foreign Secretary that Boris Johnson is talking about officials and dignitaries and potentially ministers not going to the World Cup, not our boys, in the source's words, in the England team. He was trying to show the range of hard and soft power available to show our international displeasure. Well, one person who's shown some displeasure is Gary Neville, the former captain of Manchester United, who won 80-odd caps for England, now, of course, a Sky Sports pundit. He has said about Boris Johnson, he's a useless fool. Why bring football into it? Now, Gary Neville, we suspect, is no great lover of the Tories. He launched an attack on Theresa May in a speech at the weekend. It was reported in The Sun. But there is a real storm. One Labour MP, Anna Turley, has actually supported this. But it does sound as though perhaps Boris Johnson has realised that he has caused yet another big row, and perhaps he's rowing back, according to his source. But, of course, it raises the question also about the involvement of Prince William. He is the president of the Football Association, might have been expected to go to the World Cup finals if England were to progress into the later stages. Remember, on Cup final day, he's dashing from his brother Harry's wedding to attend the Cup final. So not for the first time, no doubt not for the last either. Boris Johnson has caused a real political storm. You might say it's a political football with this suggestion that England might boycott the World Cup. Remember, back in 1980, it was the Russian invasion of Afghanistan that prompted Margaret Thatcher to call for a boycott of the Moscow Olympics. Well, that didn't happen, and the betting is probably that Boris Johnson will be backing down, but certainly he's caused a real debate.
He has. Will it be an own goal? We'll find out soon, John. Thank you. Well, let's get more now on our top story, as the former double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia are both in intensive care after falling unconscious in Salisbury city centre on Sunday. An investigative report by the BuzzFeed news site last year uncovered 14 gruesome deaths that US spy agencies have linked to Russia. Let's take a look at some of those cases now. Well, perhaps the most high profile was back in November 2006 when Alexander Litvinenko was killed by radioactive polonium, believed to have been put in a cup of tea. The UK public inquiry into his death concluded that there was a strong possibility his murder was ordered by Vladimir Putin. A couple of years later, 2008, the exiled Georgian billionaire Badri Patakashvili was found dead in his mansion in Surrey. The Russian whistleblower Alexander Peripelechny collapsed near his home, also in Surrey, in 2012. A court heard he could have been poisoned, but key evidence about his last meal was flushed away hours after his death. Boris Berezovsky, who was a close ally of Patakashvili, the two oligarchs had built up a vast business empire in Russia in the post-communist era. He was found hanged at his home in Ascot in 2013. And then there was Scott Young, the 52-year-old property tycoon, died when he fell from a fifth-floor window in Marylebone onto railings in December 2014. Well, joining me now from our studio in central London is the investigations editor for BuzzFeed, Heidi Blake, who co-wrote the report From Russia with Blood. Heidi, why do you believe all of these cases are linked? What's the evidence?
Well, my team and I at BuzzFeed News uncovered overwhelming evidence in all these 14 cases connecting these suspicious deaths to either the Russian state or mafia groups. In the case of Berezovsky, we found that he and 8 other people in his immediate circle of close associates had died in suspicious circumstances after he and Badri Patikatsishvili fled from Russia and expatriated millions of pounds worth of Russian wealth. Scott Young, the man who fell from his window and was impaled on railings in 2014, was a British fixer who had worked with Berezovsky and Patikatsishvili to move their money out of Russia. And he and several other British lawyers and business associates also died in gruesome circumstances after becoming involved in their affairs. We know that Berezovsky and Patikatsishvili were the targets of multiple assassination attempts before they finally died on British soil. And separately from that group of men, there are another 5 cases where we can see that there's evidence connecting these deaths to Russia. You mentioned one of them, Alexander Perepelichny. He was found to have traces of deadly plant poison in his stomach after he dropped dead following his decision to come to the UK and blow the whistle on Russian money laundering. And there are a number of other cases like that where people have died in highly suspicious circumstances, but every single case until now has been treated as non-suspicious by the British police.
Why do you believe that that is happening? Why is, in your view, the British police not following these up correctly?
Well, we spoke to many security and intelligence sources in both the US and the UK, some very senior serving, high-ranking officials who told us that the British government has been loath to take a firm line with the Kremlin over the past decade. Another case you mentioned was that of Alexander Litvinenko, who was famously poisoned in London by 2 Russian Secret Service assassins. The British government did accuse the Kremlin of orchestrating that assassination, and that caused 10 years of intense diplomatic pain for Britain, an absolute freeze on diplomatic relations with Moscow. And the British economy has become increasingly reliant on investment. We have billions of pounds worth of Russian money pouring into British banks and properties, but we also understand that the government is concerned about growing Russian cyber capabilities and Russia's growing military might, and therefore has been timid about standing up to Russia in many of these cases. The fact that the police have come out yesterday and made a public statement about the death of Sergei Skripal seems to indicate a bit of a step change, and it would appear from what our sources are telling us that the government is actually now facing the fact that it needs to take a firm stance when we can see evidence of what looks like another attempted Russian assassination in Britain.
And that was actually my next question to you, Heidi, because as you say, we've seen a police statement very quickly, counter-terrorism police taking over very quickly, Boris Johnson in the Commons very quickly. Do you think that this is the final one that the British government is going to take, it would seem, lying down?
I think this is a big step change. I mean, we could see from our reporting last year that there was growing pressure on the British government and British intelligence agencies to take seriously the threat of Russian assassinations in Britain. The senior serving US intelligence sources we spoke to were very angry about Britain's failure to take a firm line. And they spoke out in our reports, and I think that has resonated. I think also growing concerns about Russia's interference in Western democracies has contributed to heightening concern about this threat. And so it's good to see this being taken seriously. It does seem that a tipping point has been reached. It's good to see growing pressure across the political spectrum for a full inquiry into not just this attempted assassination, but the 14 other cases we've identified, which as yet have not been properly investigated.
Do you think that these investigations should be reopened?
Yes, I think that there needs to be a full investigation into all 14 cases, and what may be necessary is a public inquiry, because in the Litvinenko investigation, it was impossible for any other sort of inquiry to hear intelligence material in private. A public inquiry led by a security-cleared judge would be able to take evidence from MI5 and MI6 and review classified intelligence material that we know has been passed to the British government by US spy agencies as well, and then form a conclusion about the likelihood of Russian involvement in these deaths. So it's good to see there's been calls today in the House of Commons for a full investigation, and we'd certainly like to see these cases reopened and looked at properly.
There are those who say they don't need to be, including Alexander Perepelichny's wife, Tatiana, who says that she thinks his death is being used to promote a campaign against Russia. Could this not potentially be the case?
I think the evidence in the cases that we've looked at is so overwhelming. I think it's not credible to suggest that this is just a campaign to smear Russia. I mean, quite the contrary. These are cases where there is overwhelming evidence of Russian involvement in many of these deaths, and there's been nothing done about it by the British authorities. I think it's understandably very difficult for the families of some of the people involved to speak out. People are understandably scared for their own lives. That may or may not be the case with Tatiana Perepilichny. I'm aware that that is her position. But in many of the other cases we've identified, there are family members who are crying out for an investigation into the deaths of their loved ones and still looking for answers years after their deaths. And I know that they would welcome a full inquiry.
Heidi Blake, thanks very much. Heidi Blake there from BuzzFeed, who uncovered a lot of these stories. Thank you. Interrupting that report to bring you the latest news conference from Wiltshire Police now.
Support of both the police and our partner agencies in a coordinated major response. I can also say that measures necessary to ensure the safety of the public in and around the scene have also been taken. Mr. Pritchard will now read a short statement, but neither he nor I will be taking questions. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon. I'm Keir Pritchard, the Temporary Chief Constable of Wiltshire Police. As you are aware, we declared a major incident yesterday after a man and woman were taken seriously ill in Salisbury on Sunday. They both remain in a critical condition, and our thoughts and best wishes remain with their families during this difficult time. A full multi-agency response was activated and currently involves Public Health England, the NHS, local authorities in both Swindon and Wiltshire, and a wide range of partners. This has been a fast-paced investigation, and our focus has been on trying to establish what has caused these people to become critically ill and whether or not criminal activity has taken place. Since Sunday, we've had access to a wide range of specialist resources and services that have been working alongside us. You will be aware this afternoon the Metropolitan Police have confirmed that due to the unusual circumstances, the counter-terrorism network will be leading this investigation, as it has the specialist capability and expertise to do so. It is important to reiterate they have not declared this as a terrorist incident, as at this stage they are keeping an open mind as to what has happened. The advice from Public Health England remains that, based on the evidence, currently there doesn't appear to be any immediate risk to the public. We can confirm that a small number of emergency services personnel, including some officers and staff, were assessed immediately after the incident. I would like to sincerely thank members of the public for their continued assistance and for respecting the cordons which remain in place in and around the Salisbury area. I'd also like to thank our partners, staff from supporting agencies, and our officers, staff and volunteers for their dedication and hard work over the last few days. I fully understand the concerns that many of our residents in Salisbury and across the wider county may be feeling today. And I want to again reassure you there does not appear to be any immediate risk to the public. During this time, it's vital that we continue to provide an increased policing presence in the Salisbury city area, as I believe this plays an important part in helping to reassure our communities. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's get more now on our top story, the ongoing police investigation into the unexplained illness of the former Russian double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. Joining me now is Bruce Jones, a former associate of the UK Defence Academy. Good afternoon to you, Bruce Jones. The Russian embassy has said they've got serious concerns over the British media reporting of this incident. Russian media claiming this is all part of a plot by a secret group within British intelligence to discredit the Russians. Are we getting ahead of ourselves talking about this as a potential poisoning plot?
Well, it's they have got previous threat, let's put it that way. We've got the Litvinenko case, we've got various other names have come up of people who may have died in this country or who have died in mysterious circumstances, and a shed load of people who've been murdered, assassinated, or hanged themselves in Russia and even in the United States. I'm talking about Russia, mostly Russian nationals.
Why now, if this is the work of Russia, why at this point?
Well, indeed, why this week, why not last year? The guy had stopped working directly for the, or having, let's put it this way, having knowledge and serving for the Russian military intelligence a very long time ago. He'd then been in jail. So
he life in Salisbury.
Yes. There are two things to say. I mean, firstly and most importantly, that he had done consulting and he had done presentations on the workings of the GRU, the Russian military intelligence, and Russian military intelligence are the ones who set up what was going to happen in Ukraine, and they failed. They gave too optimistic a picture to Putin. The other thing is that he would have detailed knowledge. For instance, if you've been in the police or been in the Royal Marine Commandos, you'd know how that organisation works. And that experience, if you're a career officer, will stay with you for the rest of your life, and other people won't have it.
But why so close to the Russian presidential election?
Well, that's another good question. That it would suit Russia very well to, or at least Vladimir Putin, to be able to have, to cite criticism from the United Kingdom and others, and to say, effectively, as they do quite often, you know, what else could Russia do? We're being accused by these people. It's terrible. I have monitored elections in Russia, in central Siberia in midwinter. It's interesting.
What about the substance? We don't know what sort of substance it was, but what could that tell us?
Well, once that's known, and we don't know how much may have been discovered at all, that these would have been basically precautionary steps. As a Russian, he's fallen ill suddenly. You're going to have to presume that it's something very, very toxic.
And toxicology tests taking place at Bolton Down.
Indeed. The other side of it is that, for instance, the Palestinian who was assassinated in a hotel room in Dubai by the Israelis a few years ago, it took them a very long time to establish what had been used. So the other end of the spectrum is we never know what was used.
If he's in a critical condition, Colonel Skripal, at the moment, if he does pull through, what sort of information and intelligence will he be able to tell the security services? Well,
presumably know about his actual attack would be no more than what was seen in the restaurant. But if anything strange had happened over the previous few days or months, then he would have reported it anyway, but it's possible, added to some other information, that might form some kind of a pattern.
You think this has the hallmarks of a Kremlin-sanctioned attack?
It's highly suspicious, let's put it that way, yeah. I mean, the guy would have been very surveillance aware, for instance, so it's difficult to say what he could add at this point.
OK. Bruce Jones, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Well, in a moment, we'll hear from our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magnay, but first to our chief political correspondent, John Craig in Westminster. Unsanctioned or unpunished, what sort of things is Boris Johnson talking about? Much controversy over potential boycott of the World Cup, John Craig.
Yes, well, immediately after his common statement, there was a meeting of the National Security Council chaired by the Prime Minister in the Cabinet Room in Downing Street. All the signs are this was pretty hastily convened. It wasn't in the diary, and it was a result of counter-terrorist chiefs taking over the investigation in Salisbury. They were briefed, according to Number 10, on the investigation, and there was also earlier a meeting of officials. No Cobra meeting as such, but the National Security Council is the most senior body, of course, dealing with these sort of things. Every chance it may meet again in the next few days. Immediately prior to that meeting in Number 10, the Foreign Secretary, after his initial statement, took a lot of questions. And when he was asked by the Labour MP Toby Perkins what sort of sanctions the government had in mind against Russia, he said this.
If things turn out to be as many members, I think, on both sides, I suspect that they are, to return to that formula, I think we will have to have a serious conversation about our engagement with Russia. And for my own part, I think it will be very difficult to see how we can, thinking ahead to the World Cup this July, this summer, I think it will be very difficult to imagine that UK representation at that event could go ahead in the normal way, and we would certainly have to consider that.
Well, that triggered a huge row with Gary Neville, a former Manchester United captain, an England player of 80-odd caps, Sky Sports pundit and commentator these days, saying he's a useless fool, why bring football into it? Well, MPs reacted pretty angrily, some of them. Toby Perkins said it was insane, but Boris Johnson's aides tried to calm down the row, not altogether successfully, saying that he was meaning officials and dignitaries and potentially government ministers not going to the World Cup, not our boys, as a source put it, from the England team. He was trying to show the range of hard and soft power available to show our international displeasure. Well, of course, back in 1980, Margaret Thatcher, following on from Ronald Reagan ordering the Americans not to go to the Moscow Olympics, tried to persuade the British Olympic Association not to go to Moscow. She failed. And, of course, that was the games when Seb Coe won a gold medal. So Mr Johnson appears to be backtracking here. And Number 10 this afternoon, asked about his comments, were echoing those made by Boris Johnson's officials. But there are some MPs who agree with him there should be a boycott. Others say there should have been pressure put on FIFA 2 years ago not to stage the World Cup in Moscow. But for now, looks as though the England team are going, but not any government ministers or the Blazers, if you like, from the FA on a nice junket.
OK, John, let's bring in Diana Magnay now. Boris Johnson talking tough in the House of Commons. The Russian embassy also with some stern words, Diana.
That's right, and the Russian Foreign Ministry perhaps with some even sterner words. Maria Zakharova, the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, calling Boris Johnson's comments wild. We've obviously heard earlier today from the Kremlin also about this case, calling it tragic, saying that they are willing to cooperate with the British if the British were only to ask them, but that, of course, they do not have any further knowledge about this. But I suppose what you have is that the view here is that this is, to borrow a favourite Russian phrase, a provocation, that it will serve only to further blacken the good name of Russia in the minds of many officials in this country. And that is what Sergei Markov, who you'll listen to just now, certainly believes. Let's take a listen.
I think accusation of Russia in the poisoning of Mr. Litvinenko is part of the propagandistic Russophobic campaign and demonization of Vladimir Putin. It's deal nothing with reality. Mr. Litvinenko play a role in some of the criminal case, and Mr. Litvinenko had no any real threat to the interests of Russian Federation. And I can repeat again, Russia don't kill its political opponents.
That is a view that is certainly not shared across the board, and certainly not internationally. I spoke with one security analyst who said if it is proven to be Russia, then it's probable that there was some kind of high-level directive. But bear in mind that with the Litvinenko investigation, it took 10 years for Sir Robert Owen to reach his conclusions, which only probably pointed to Vladimir Putin's involvement. So it is very, very murky territory, and we are at the very beginning of investigating this case.
Diana McNay, thank you.
Counter-terrorism police are now leading the investigation into why a former Russian agent and his daughter suddenly fell ill in Salisbury on Sunday afternoon. Britain's Chemical and Biological Weapons Centre is testing the substance they were exposed to. Sergei Skripal, a double agent who was convicted in Russia of passing state secrets to MI6, is fighting for his life in hospital along with his daughter Yulia. It's still not known what caused them to collapse. But the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has promised a robust response if there is conclusive evidence that Russia was involved. With the latest from Salisbury, here's Tom Simons.
A father and a daughter apparently struck down in public on a Sunday afternoon in Salisbury. The BBC revealed today that Yulia Skripal had been visiting her father, Sergei, from Russia when it happened. They were left fighting for their lives.
Her eyes were just completely white. They were wide open, but just white and frothing at the mouth. And then the man went stiff. His arms stopped moving, but it's still looking dead straight.
CCTV images obtained by the BBC appeared to show Mr. Skripal and his daughter walking together at 15:47 on Sunday afternoon. They were heading for a small park surrounded by shops in the centre of Salisbury called the Maltings. The camera which captured these pictures is yards from where they were found. Police were called at 4:15 when people reported the pair were unconscious on a park bench. Last night, Zizi, an Italian restaurant nearby, was sealed by police, followed today by a local pub, Bishop's Mill. Did someone slip something into their food or drink? For the police, this is a highly sensitive and potentially hazardous investigation, not least for the officers involved. The key question, of course, is what was the substance that left a father and his daughter in such a terrible condition on the park bench covered by the tent behind me? There will be toxicology reports prepared, but we understand that several police officers were admitted to hospital. One has been kept in. Symptoms include breathing difficulties and itchy eyes. Experts at the research facility Porton Down are now involved, testing for a wide range of substances.
From things that are chemically toxic to things that are radiological, such as that was used against Litvinenko. I think people will have an open mind. They'll be looking at what's in the environment, what's on the clothing, on the skin of the people, and also what's in blood and urine and any other samples.
So far, the tiny Wiltshire police force has led the investigation, but that changed today in a significant development.
This afternoon, the Metropolitan Police have confirmed that due to the unusual circumstances, the counter-terrorism network will be leading this investigation, as it has the specialist capability and expertise to do so.
After all, as the Foreign Secretary made clear in Parliament this afternoon, this incident could have implications for Britain's relationship with Russia.
Should evidence emerge that implies state responsibility, then Her Majesty's government will respond appropriately and robustly.
Sergei Skripal was arrested in 2004, accused of spying for MI6, convicted, and in 2010 handed over to Britain as part of a spy swap. Sergei Skripal's wife, elder brother and son have died in recent years. The family believe in suspicious circumstances. He has been living quietly here for some years, but under his own name. He would not have been hard to find. Tom Simons, BBC News, Salisbury.
Well, the Russian embassy in London says the plight of Sergei Skripal and his daughter causes serious concern, but they also accuse the media of fueling an anti-Russian campaign by creating the impression it was a planned operation by Russian special services, something they categorically deny. In Moscow, a spokesman for President Putin described the situation as tragic. From Moscow, here's Steve Rosenberg.
It sounds chillingly familiar. Russia under suspicion of planning and executing an attack 2,000 miles away in Britain. In 2006, the target was former Russian agent Alexander Litvinenko, murdered in London. The man Britain believes poisoned him is Andrei Lugovoy. Today, he dismissed claims that Moscow had attacked Sergei Skripal as propaganda.
Why do they say he was poisoned? Perhaps he poisoned himself, or had a heart attack.
You talk about propaganda, but what about Alexander Litvinenko? The inquiry in Britain into his death found that you had poisoned him, probably on the orders of Vladimir Putin.
There was no official investigation into Litvinenko's death. There was an attempt to accuse Russia and a Russian citizen, me, of poisoning him in Britain with polonium.
As for the Kremlin, well, it's been saying very little today about Sergei Skripal. President Putin's spokesman told me earlier, we have no information about what happened. We cannot comment, although he did add it was a tragic situation. But catching spies has become one of Vladimir Putin's priorities. Yesterday, he congratulated Russia's security service, the FSB. It uncovered 397 spies last year. Spy mania, and now a former double agent collapsing in Britain. Moscow denies any connection, but it can only add to the chill in relations between the UK and Russia. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Sergei Skripal has been living in the UK for several years now. He came to Britain as part of a high-profile spy swap involving Russia and the United States in 2010. So if he has been poisoned, why would he be targeted now? Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera reports.
Does the long arm of the Kremlin reach all the way from Moscow to Salisbury in Wiltshire? And if the attack on Sergei Skripal did come from Russia, why? After being released from jail, Skripal had spent the last 8 years living quietly in Salisbury, but he still had enemies.
Sergei Skripal had been imprisoned in Russia for selling secrets to British intelligence here at MI6. It was claimed that he provided the identity of hundreds of Russians operating undercover in Europe. Even though he'd been pardoned as part of a spy swap, his former colleagues would still have regarded him as a traitor.
The fact that he blew a whole range of Russian agents, there may be personal animosities there. So the fact that he was a British spy and former member of the Russian military, in most Russians' minds actually, will categorise him as a traitor. So yes, there will have been people there, there are people there who will be delighted to see him dead.
No one yet is confirming that Moscow was involved, but there have been other incidents involving Russians in the UK. As we've heard, most famously Alexander Litvinenko, another former Russian spy poisoned in London's Mayfair. And there have been other figures whose deaths have aroused suspicions, like Badri Patakatsishvili. Alexander Perepelichny died suddenly jogging in Surrey. One test revealed traces of a rare toxin in his stomach, and a businessman campaigning over his death says not enough has been done to deter Russia.
Based on the reaction of the British government to the murder in Mayfair using nuclear material of Alexander Litvinenko, which was nothing, it basically gave a green light to Vladimir Putin that he could do whatever he wants here. And he has been doing whatever he wants here for quite a while.
It is still too early to be sure where this investigation will go. But if the trail does connect Salisbury to Moscow, then the pressure will be on the British government to respond. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.
Our Deputy Political Editor John Pienaar is in Westminster, and that is the question. Just how seriously will the government be taking this investigation now?
They're taking it seriously, Sophie. Boris Johnson wasn't holding back today. The government's National Security Council discussed this earlier on today in Downing Street. The Prime Minister was there, and one government source told me the aim was to respond robustly and send a message that Britain wanted to be seen in the front line of nations confronting Russia's threat to international order. So this is about Britain's place in the world as well. At one point today, Boris Johnson also raised a question over Britain's involvement in the Football World Cup in Russia. Russia, though officials very quickly pointed out that was about officials and ministers, not the England football team. Now, Russia, this evening, the Russian embassy has issued a derisive statement, sarcastically mocking Boris Johnson for finding Russia guilty before any inquiry has even started. But tonight, the government is very keen to show that Britain will not be a country that stands idly by if it's shown that a potentially aggressive power has carried out a murderous plot on the streets of Britain.
John Pinar in Westminster, thank you.
Counter-terror police have taken over the inquiry into the collapse of a former Russian double agent and his daughter on a Salisbury Park bench. Sergei Skripal and his daughter both remain in critical condition in hospital tonight after being exposed to an unknown substance. The former spy was granted refuge in the United Kingdom after a spy swap with the Kremlin back in 2010 and settled in the cathedral city. And it was here he and his daughter were discovered, slumped on that park bench on Sunday afternoon. Paul McNamara joins us now from Salisbury. Paul.
Evening, John. Just behind me, about 100 feet over there, beneath that tent, is actually the bench where this former spy and his daughter were found. Now, 48 hours later, the police cordon's still here, and it's now an investigation that's drawn comment from the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. Today we've been speaking to the Russian agent's neighbours. None of them could confirm whether or not they had any idea about his past. And this afternoon we've learned that samples from this scene have been taken to the military research laboratory in Porton Down. Experts there trying to discover just what the substance behind all this is. When double agent Sergei Skripal was arrested, it was done publicly on the streets of Russia in full view of the TV cameras. When he collapsed under the influence of an unknown substance 14 years later, it happened out of the spotlight in the back streets of a quiet English cathedral city, leaving the question now, did one lead to the other? Today, the scene where he was found slumped remains cordoned off in every direction, and we discovered the identity of the woman found with him, his 33-year-old daughter, Yulia. Tonight, both remain in critical condition. Police have secured this restaurant since yesterday. It's thought Sergei and his daughter ate here early on Sunday afternoon. That restaurant is just at the end of this walkway. It's believed they walked down past this gym on the corner, and it now appears that their CCTV cameras may have captured the moment they walked past. They then crossed this bridge, and now just over there, just past the police and the media, you can just see the bench where Sergei Skripal and a woman we now believe to be his daughter stopped, their behaviour causing members of the public to call police just after 4 p.m. This is the grainy footage believed to show a glimpse of Sergei and his daughter soon before being found slumped and semi-conscious. Freya works at the nearby gym. She had just finished her shift when she saw them.
He was slumped sort of like this, and she was slumped into his chest, leaning on him. I don't know, they looked like they'd been there a little while, just the way that their bags were down and they were both slumped on each other. I just thought that they were just homeless people that had taken something too strong. I did feel a bit anxious, like I should maybe try and help because she looked worse than he did. But I was a bit nervous, so I just walked on.
Sergei and Yulia were rushed to Salisbury District Hospital. Yesterday, parts of the A&E were shut down and specialist teams sent in to decontaminate. Well, there are no cordons here anymore. The major incident that was declared is now over and the hospital is back to being fully operational. But it wasn't just the two people at the centre of this incident that were brought here. A number of people from the emergency services also received treatment, and at least one of them stayed here overnight. Colonel Sergei Skripal's backstory is more spy thriller than suburbia. A former military officer jailed for 13 years in 2006. Convicted of informing MI6 of the identities of Russian intelligence staff working undercover in Europe. His freedom traded in 2010, a spy exchange captured here. All of that a world away from his recent life lived on this cul-de-sac in Salisbury. His neighbours tell of a polite, quiet man who kept himself to himself. This afternoon, the local police said this investigation had been taken out of their hands.
This afternoon, the Metropolitan Police have confirmed that due to the unusual circumstances, the counter-terrorism network will be leading this investigation, as it has the specialist capability and expertise to do so.
Tonight, there is no confirmation of what lines of inquiry police are pursuing. Only questions as to why this former spy and his daughter lie in critical condition.
Well, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson told the Commons that he's not pointing fingers, but warned that Britain will respond robustly if evidence of state responsibility for the Salisbury incident emerges. And in a sign of the very strained relations with Moscow, the Foreign Secretary took the extraordinary step of describing Russia as a malign and disruptive force. For their part, a spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry dismissed Mr. Johnson's comments as wild. Our political correspondent Michael Crick joins us. Michael.
Well, relations between Britain and Russia look like becoming frostier in the next few days than they have been at any time for many decades. Theresa May chaired a meeting of the National Security Council this afternoon, a full meeting, and tonight the Russian embassy issued their second statement in response to Boris Johnson, accusing him of speaking as if the investigation was already over and that Russia was found responsible, and saying that it looks like the script of yet another anti-Russian campaign has already been written. But frankly, the mood amongst the political community here on all sides, I think, here at Westminster, is that perhaps for far too long, Britain has been too soft on Moscow, has turned too much of a blind eye. And Boris Johnson made it clear today that Britain will take very strong action if it's found that the Russians are behind what happened in Salisbury. But what might that consist of? Well, for one thing, probably more economic sanctions against Russia and against Vladimir Putin and his business friends. The trouble is that right now you need to negotiate sanctions with your allies, and right now it's probably not the best time to be negotiating such things with the European Union in the midst of Brexit talks, and of course at a time when so many EU states depend upon Russia for their energy supplies. Cabinet ministers, surprisingly perhaps, didn't discuss Colonel Skripal when they held their weekly meeting this morning, nor had ministers much to say just afterwards. Doesn't all this rather make Britain look incredibly powerless, scared of Putin and whatever he might do? Really give him a license to kill?
I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to answer any of your questions, but I'm sure that MPs will be able to question the government very soon.
And Boris Johnson, trying not to rush to judgment, told MPs the government was already responding fully to what he called Russian acts of war in the recent past.
Though I am not now pointing fingers, because we cannot, Mr. Speaker, as you'll understand, point fingers, I say to governments around the world that no attempt to take innocent life on UK soil will go either unsanctioned or unpunished.
But several MPs raised the 14 other suspicious deaths which have been linked to Moscow.
And there are serious questions about whether the police investigations were thorough enough. Will he now, as a result of what he said, discuss urgently with the Home Secretary whether an NCA investigation or other form of police further investigation and review of all of those 14 cases should now take place?
And several Tory backbenchers suggested the British authorities have been weak.
No, they're not taking it seriously at all. It's almost like we don't want to investigate. It's almost like we're looking the other way. And I think this is a profound mistake. We have to get wise to this. This is not just about finger wagging. It's not just about waving a stick at the Russians or being disapproving. It's working out what the Russians are up to and finding ways to counter this and actually having a serious foreign policy here.
Vladimir Putin's spokesman offered to help any investigation, but Moscow called Boris Johnson's common statement wild. Andrei Lugovoy, one of those suspected of the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko, said this was a propagandist, bogus story. The Russian embassy in London accused British media of anti-Russia vilification, denying their special services had anything to do with Colonel Skripal and his daughter. Back in Russia, a dolphin display today marked 100 days till the Football World Cup. And Boris Johnson today initially seemed to suggest England might boycott the tournament.
Thinking ahead to the World Cup this July, this summer, I think it will be very difficult to imagine that UK representation at that event could go ahead in the normal way. And we would certainly
But he
have
meant
to,
government representation, and Aid later said, not the England team.
This is my point. You need to have a consistent and robust position. You can't just chuck out impromptu ideas and then have to row back on them. This is where Boris Johnson does immeasurable damage to the strength of our relationship with the Russian Federation. I want us to have a good relationship with them. I think Putin and Lavrov and the whole of his team respects it when you're clear, consistent, and follow up on your threats.
Whatever we learn about the Skripals, the cross-party message to ministers seems to be, get tougher with Putin.
Well, now the United Kingdom has long been a favourite for Russian expats, oligarchs and exiles looking for a base away from Moscow for their families and their money. While many enjoy the most exclusive postcodes and send their children to prestigious schools, an alarming number of powerful Russians here have died mysteriously in recent years. Today, the government claimed to be acting robustly, but critics accuse successive British governments of being timid when it comes to standing up to Vladimir Putin. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, looks back at the past allegations surrounding other Russians who previously made the UK their home, only to die here in murky circumstance.
From Salisbury, via the plush mansions of Surrey to central London, the death list of Russians meeting their end in ever more untraceable circumstances grows year by year. Is it the Russian government? Is it the Russian mafia? Is it Russia at all? Valery Morozov, once Moscow's chosen man to construct the Sochi Winter Olympic Games, now exiled in Surrey. Whatever happened in Wiltshire, he claims, it isn't Putin's work.
Immediately, British officials and British press, British mass media started blaming Putin himself. And frankly speaking, it is not only not true from my point of view, and not correct, but it puts real refugees in danger. And I know that the only rule, which is, or let us put it, the main rule there, is you should not create problem for Kremlin. That's how I survived.
Whether or not Putin, the Kremlin or Russia have anything to do with it, the Russian death list on British soil lengthens. The past methodology in at least one case apparently designed to be as untraceable as possible. Most notorious of all, former FSB agent Alexander Litvinenko, who died in London in 2006. A British inquiry found 2 Russian agents in this London hotel poisoned him, almost certainly, it said, on Kremlin orders. An agonizing death from radioactive polonium eventually ended his life. And the Downing Street response to Moscow's radioactive attack in London, 4 diplomatic expulsions.
What message does that tell to Vladimir Putin, which is the UK has laid out the welcome mat for you to send your assassins to settle any scores you want, and here in the UK without any consequence?
Whistleblower Alexander Perepelichny died in Surrey in 2012. Natural causes, said police. But then, traces of a rare and lethal plant poison used in the past by Russian assassins were found in his stomach. Boris Berezovsky, exiled oligarch and one-time Putin rival, found hanged in this Surrey mansion a year later. Death by suicide, said the British authorities. Others are not convinced. And it's not just Russians, but their British associates, like 32-year-old Scott Young, fixer to the oligarchs. Did he fall onto these railings in London from the building above, or was he pushed? He's one of half a dozen apparently healthy British men, associates of rich Russian exiles, to die here in recent years, almost all suicides or heart attacks, say the authorities.
Put bluntly, the charge is that successive British governments have in effect allowed Russians to come into London and beyond and get away with murder again and again and again. And that's because these governments are simply frightened that if they really reacted, then the money that the Russians bring into the British economy would stop. And also frightened that if they did respond, Moscow would retaliate.
Theresa May personally intervened to delay the inquiry into Alexander Litvinenko's death, citing international relations issues. Then Home Secretary Amber Rudd blocked the disclosure of, quote, sensitive material to the inquest into Alexander Perepelichny's death. Nonetheless, UK governments always insist they are robust with Moscow, and today was no exception, of course. And the UK is party to extensive economic sanctions imposed on Russia after its intervention in Ukraine.
Words are incredibly cheap, and Putin knows that. The only thing that he respects is real consequences, and until I see those consequences, I don't have any confidence in the government to do anything.
It's not just the UK, however. The heart of American political power also touched by the curious death of an influential Russian a long, long way from home. The case of Mikhail Lesin, Russia's former press minister, found dead in his Washington hotel room with blunt trauma injuries to his arms, legs, head and torso. The police said he fell over when intoxicated.
It is embarrassing to be Russian these days, but don't ever be ashamed of who you are.
A toxic brew of Putin's mafia state, currently the stuff of mainstream TV drama. Timid though, surely, set against the characters and mysteries of real lives lost.
Well, with me is the journalist and, of course, the author of McMafia, Misha Glenny, and Alexander Nekrasov, a former advisor to the Russian government. But first, from Westminster Conservative MP Tom Tugendhat, chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you for joining us, Tom Tugendhat. Of course, you have a military background. You've probably intersected sometimes with the intelligence services. What's your reading of what we're looking at today?
Well, it's very hard to give a definitive answer, but it certainly does fit a pattern, and it's the pattern that concerns me. It's a pattern that we've seen not only in the United Kingdom, but also in parts of the Balkans, where Russian agents have sought to achieve their aims by using murder as a means of state policy. We saw it here in the United Kingdom, of course, with the Litvinenko attack, but we also saw it in Montenegro only recently, an incident which led to the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson saying, quite rightly in December, that it had all the fingerprints of the Kremlin all over it.
I mean, have the Russians got away with it for too long? I mean, the truth, once you start looking at the laundry list of killings in the years 2000 onwards, you're looking at quite a number of people.
Well, there's certainly, I mean, one's got to be careful not to get too overexcited about this. It's quite clear that Russia has been seeking to eliminate its enemies, or rather Putin's enemies, by using murder as a means of policy for a number of years now. But it would be wrong to say that they've murdered everybody. They certainly haven't done that. They're not all powerful by any means. In fact, the very fact that they have to use murder as a means of state policy explains the weakness in the internal regime, that it is fundamentally so fraught with rivals and with conflict that they actually can't get through a normal political transition.
Well, now, I mean, one obvious question is, if you have a spy swap, don't you have an obligation actually to provide pretty considerable protection?
Well, it's too early to know whether or not we do have a spy swap, and it's too early to know whether or not the Russians did murder Mr. Skripal. So I'm not going to comment directly on those two events. But what is certainly clear is that Russia has, over the years, used murder, and certainly seems to not be averse to continuing with that pattern. And indeed, they've also used force to change borders in Eastern Europe, as we've seen in Ukraine, in Crimea, and of course in Georgia. And we've seen them using kidnap as well, when they grabbed the Estonian border official in only a few years ago. So we're seeing a very aggressive regime, in fact, an aggressive regime which is propping up a giant kleptocracy.
Well, I'll come back to you in just a moment, but I'd just like to bring in our other two guests. Misha Glenny, of course, McMafia crosses the great divide between the mafia, if you like, business and the rest of it, corrupt business, and the state. So, which is in play today?
Well, it's difficult to tell until we have the forensic evidence so that we know what's going on. There are a couple of things I would say. It looks more like state than crime, I have to say, but you have to ask yourself two things before we get the forensic evidence, is why now? Why in advance of the presidential elections in Russia, and why in advance of the World Cup? It seems a difficult time to be doing it.
Let me just stop you for a moment, because are we saying, therefore, in fact, if it was crime, it would be guns? If it's a state, it's generally poison?
Yes, crime would certainly not have, you know, if you're talking about polonium, for example, that is generally not crime.
I mean, you wrote a factual book about McMafia.
That's
It's no
right.
fiction, not like the
that's right.
television, although you had a hand in that. But
they tend to shoot you if it's criminal.
But I don't think, in fact, we have any evidence of a criminal gang poisoning people.
I certainly haven't come across it in terms of this context. It's certainly not.
So let me turn to you, Alexander Nekrasov. I mean, you're a former Kremlin advisor. You know your own countrymen and your own political system well. What's your reading of what's going on?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that nobody yet knows what happened. But unfortunately, the British government has already decided what happened. Because Boris Johnson says, I am not pointing fingers, and then he points fingers. You can't use that sort of language and say, well, we are waiting for the investigation to finish. Unfortunately, the Russians see this as a campaign against Russia. Because the way the media behaves, the way the politicians behave, nothing is yet known, nothing has been discovered. The man has been here for, what, 8 years?
But even you would accept that it's a bit of a pattern. I mean, you saw that report from
You can
Alex
draw
Thompson.
a pattern from anything, and you can, start accusing people of anything. But in this particular case, the reaction was too much. It was over-the-top reaction. Suddenly, meetings going on, parliament and so on, and the police has not provided anything, The anti-terrorist police are just starting. Nobody knows what happened. And what I find bizarre myself about the Kremlin's reaction is that the spokesman for President Putin says, we are prepared to help. How on earth is he going to help? The man was here for 8 years. No, but this is still silly, what he's saying, because the man was under protection of MI5, I'm supposing, I don't know. So it's probably the questions are to MI5, what he was doing, whom he was connected to. The point is, if his daughter was allowed to visit him from Moscow, that means Russian intelligence was of no interest to them.
It certainly does. It raises a very important point, John, about he is part of a spy swap. We know that. And intelligence services do have protocols. They do have rules. They talk to each other and they behave in a certain way. It's a sort of honor amongst thieves, as it were. And if he was killed by the FSB or part of the intelligence apparatus in Russia, the question is why? They wouldn't have done it just for revenge. They would have been thinking that maybe he was active again as a spy. There are many unknowns about this situation.
Well, this is the thing, Tom Tugendhat, because actually, in fact, as Michael Crick reported, MPs were very quick to say we're simply not tough enough with the Russians. They were using this incident, even just suppose it was actually crime rather than terror.
Well, look, Misha made his point very clearly that this doesn't have the hallmarks of crime and that we've seen Russia behaving abominably elsewhere. And actually, I'm afraid Alexander's completely correct. It's far too early to comment as to whether or not this incident was state-sponsored Russian murder again, or whether it was something else. But for those of us who've been observing Russian actions over the past number of years, we're seeing a continuous pattern. They demoralize, they destabilize, they bring about a crisis, and then they normalize. And in doing so, they incrementally push everybody downhill, trying to make sure that other people's alliances and relationships within the state are as degraded as theirs. And I think that's an extremely dangerous pattern. We're seeing it, by the way, through their use of propaganda, through their use of state-sponsored media, some of which are headquartered here in the United Kingdom, and we're seeing it through their use of bots and troll farms and other forms of social media. So actually what we're seeing is a continuous pattern of Russian soft war against the West. And I think that's what we've got to face up to and respond to. And that's why I welcome Tobias Ellwood, for example, the Defence Minister calling for an increase in the defence budget from 2 to about 2.5%. And I welcome very much the clarity with which the Foreign Secretary spoke today in the House of Commons.
Well, Boris Johnson did indeed sort of talk about being tough with the Russians and the rest of it. But in fact, in a post-Brexit world, Russia is precisely the kind of nation needy for many of the things that we produce that presumably the government would be liking to do business with. Are we in a particularly strong position when it comes to being tough on Russia?
Yes, we are, absolutely. I mean, let's not forget who we are as a country. I mean, you know my position on the Brexit vote, John. You don't need to go over that again. But the idea that we're going to split from our partners in NATO because of the Brexit vote, I'm afraid is for the birds. It's simply not true. And nor are we going to stop trading with our European partners. So the idea that this sort of puts us somehow at the mercy of Moscow, I'm afraid, is fantasyland. We are absolutely one of the world's great powers. We're still one of the world's major economies. We still spend more in defence and have better hardware than almost anyone else. I mean, if one remembers the chugging sight of something that looked rather more like a Hull trawler going through the English Channel recently, and it turned out that in fact it wasn't some decrepit fishing vessel, but it was actually a Russian aircraft carrier, one realises that although we may be undermanned and underfunded for what we think we need, and indeed I believe we do need, you know, we outmatch Russia's decrepit military power very solidly.
Well, Alexander Nekrasov, I mean, where is this going to lead, for goodness sake? I mean, are you happy to see things get worse, or is there any chance that Mr. Putin might perhaps try to warm relations?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to stop bashing Russia, saying that it is interfering everywhere, and then the West is doing nothing. The West is watching without, helplessly. The British soldiers are on the Russian border. The NATO is surrounding Russia.
Well, that's for obvious reasons. The Russians have been fairly aggressive in that area.
The cyber war is committed by the West as well. Don't forget about that. So let's not bash only Russia and say Russia is the aggressor. Everybody's doing it. So I don't see how it can happen that only one side is involved in it and the others are not.
Well, maybe this time tomorrow night we'll know a little bit more about it and we'll try to explore it then. Thank you very much, all three of you, for coming in. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, Rohit, let's come to you. What are the security services? I mean, this appears to be one of their spies, potentially, who's been, attacked here in Britain. What do they make of all this?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. We've heard it throughout the coverage. One of the features of this case is people saying it's too early to speculate before then going on to speculate about precisely what they think has happened here. There are very few facts. Let's be absolutely clear about that. And actually, in that sense, all of those Russian television news anchors who were speaking in my report earlier are absolutely correct. But this is largely speculation. But here is one fact. Russia is now considered to be the #1 international threat among the intelligence community. Make no mistake. Perhaps it's not talked about by us enough because there is such a multitude of domestic threats from terrorism. But Alex Younger, the MI6 chief, said it himself a few months ago. He talked about Russia posing a fundamental threat. British officials are clear that this is the country not only of fake news, but of course of that ongoing Syrian bombardment and of course the annexation of Crimea. And many observers here believe that this has all followed a generation of complacency about the threat that is posed by Russia. It may well be that after this incident, if the facts indicate that Russia was involved, and based on the Litvinenko case, that might take several years to establish, that this is a change to that generation of complacency. But once again, that is merely speculation.
OK, Rohit, thank you very much indeed.
Tonight, Sergei Skripal, a former colonel in the Russian military intelligence who was convicted of passing state secrets to MI6, and his 33-year-old daughter Julia, are still in a critical condition in hospital in Salisbury. In hospital, too, is one of the emergency services personnel who attended the scene when they were found unconscious in the town. The military research facility at Porton Down is believed to be examining unknown material, and the counter-terrorism policing network at the Met is now in charge of the investigation. But so far, we know nothing about what happened to them, if they were poisoned, or if they were, by whom. That didn't stop the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson addressing the Commons to say the disturbing incident had echoes of the death of Alexander Litvinenko and that Russia is, in many respects, a malign and disruptive force. I'm joined by our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, for the latest. What have you been hearing?
Well, Kirsty, we've known since Sunday afternoon when this happened that Sergei and his daughter Yulia were in critical condition. This was the phrase used, and it's been consistently used over the last couple of days. But what I'm hearing tonight is, despite the sending of those samples to Porton Down, that they still do not know what poisoned this pair of individuals on Sunday, and they're very worried about this. One said to me, we are treating symptoms rather than causes, and that's not a good direction to be going in. Another person said to me that Colonel Skripal was not at all in a good way this evening. There's a lot of concern, I think, that their condition could worsen.
Well, thank you. We'll be joining you again shortly. Well, let's go live now to Salisbury, where our correspondent Katie Raza has been looking into the life of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Julia. Katie.
Hello, I've been spending the day in Salisbury trying to find out more about Mr. Skripal and about why he chose to live in Wiltshire, in this city predominantly known for its wonderful 13th century cathedral. Today, things continued almost as normal here. The market was on in the city centre, though passers-by did appear perplexed, bemused and even a little fearful to see parts of that centre cordoned off and guarded by the police. I learnt more about Yulia Skripal, the daughter who we now know was found with her father when the pair fell ill on Sunday afternoon. Family friends have told us that although Yulia originally did move to the UK to live with her family, she missed Russia and now lives in Moscow and has worked for various multinationals, including Nike and PepsiCo. She is Mr. Skripal's only surviving child. His son died, we understand, reportedly of liver failure just last year. His wife had died of cancer here in the UK just 5 years before. Amongst the graves, in a cemetery in the Wiltshire city of Salisbury, lies Lyudmila Skripal, wife of the former Russian colonel Sergei Skripal. Across the grass, we found the resting place of the couple's son, who died, according to relatives, in suspicious circumstances in St. Petersburg last year. 2 Russians buried on British soil, their closest living relatives now fighting for their lives in the local hospital. A father brought to the UK in a spy exchange in 2010. We discovered today the woman found beside him in the centre of Salisbury on Sunday afternoon was his 33-year-old daughter, Yulia. The Skripal house was being guarded by officers today, a quiet cul-de-sac now the focus of huge attention. Newsnight's been told by a family friend that Sergei Skripal chose to relocate to this city because he believed it was a good area with a low crime rate. We understand initially the family moved here to Salisbury, though both adult children were able to travel back and forth between Russia and Wiltshire freely, despite their father's banishment. A family friend told Newsnight they believed Yulia had missed her home country. They said they thought she'd returned to Russia. Then in 2014 she was back in the UK working at a hotel in Southampton before moving again to Russia. We were tipped off that the city's Railway Social Club had played host to the former Russian spy. A source had told Newsnight Mr. Skripal's only friends were in British intelligence, but here we saw his application for membership, a sign perhaps that he was trying to find some kind of local life.
It tells me that he applied for membership on the 22nd of October. That was when we posted it on the board for other people to say yes or no to him being a member of the club. Then it went to the committee and they decided on the 15th of November that yes, he was a member, could be a member, and so subsequently we issued him with a membership card.
Salisbury's inhabitants are unused to being at the centre of an international incident, with police today confirming a development.
You will be aware this afternoon the Metropolitan Police have confirmed that due to the unusual circumstances, the counter-terrorism network will be leading this investigation, as it has the specialist capability and expertise to do so. It is important to reiterate they have not declared this as a terrorist incident, as at this stage they are keeping an open mind as to what has happened.
The police are an unusually visible presence here. They've closed the local branch of Zizzi's. It's assumed Mr. Skripal and his daughter must have visited the restaurant on Sunday. They were then captured on CCTV walking down this alley. This footage taken less than half an hour before they were found slumped on a bench. That bench hidden by a tent. Whatever samples have been recovered from Mr. Skripal and his daughter in hospital are being analysed at Porton Down, the chemical and biological warfare facility a few miles from here. It's been reported that Mr. Skripal had voiced concerns that he could be the subject of an assassination attempt. But one family friend told Newsnight they believed Yulia Skripal wasn't worried enough about her own safety. Both remain tonight in a critical condition in intensive care.
Katie Razzle in Salisbury. Well, Mark is still here. Have you got any more information on Sergei Skripal's life in the UK?
Well, I've heard some similar things to the lines that Katie picked up, that for years his social life, if you can call it that, revolved largely around MI6 people who were looking after him. Apparently they were frequent visitors, and I'm told it's part of what they regard as the aftercare package, that it's a lifelong bond with somebody who's given information. The daughter and the son travel back and forth a lot. And I've heard some indications that she may have been back, Yulia this is, for the anniversary last week, the 1st of March. It was Sasha, the son's birthday, and it was going to be a particularly difficult time for Yuri Skripal, and it's thought that may well be why she was with him and giving him support over those few days. It may also be that that was the last time that some of his friends from British intelligence were there as well.
Tell me about the significance of both the graves of his wife and his son being in Salisbury.
Well, from what one can gather, because he lived in a fairly isolated way, these were a very important part of his life. I mean, we know that his son, Sasha, died while in St. Petersburg, and clearly efforts were made to bring the body back to the UK so that he could be buried here, and so that Sergei Skripal could grieve at his grave.
They've also got news on political reaction and also some of the other cases where Russia is allegedly involved.
Well, look, until we get some definite indication on this, everybody's just going to make assumptions because of Litvinenko, because of some of these other incidents where, you know, people have been targeted. And that's the problem now, in a way. You know, there was a list of 14 compiled by BuzzFeed, suspicious death. Now, of course, some of these may be entirely innocent, but of course, because of what's happened, the presumption immediately goes to Russian organised crime or intelligence services, and was this assassination?
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Well, earlier I spoke to the Conservative MP, Tom Tugendhat. You got your piece first, sorry, I'm terribly sorry.
It is too early to speculate as to the precise nature of the crime or attempted crime that has taken place in Salisbury yesterday. But I know members will have their suspicions. And what I will say to the House is that if those suspicions prove to be well-founded, then this government will take whatever measures we deem necessary to protect the lives of the people in this country, our values and our freedoms.
A tough statement from the Foreign Secretary with its reference to crime committed in Salisbury, and potentially highly embarrassing if Russia had nothing to do with it.
What's your message to Russia?
But Boris had clearly been briefed by the police and intelligence services. The Russian embassy took umbrage at his statement, its press secretary commenting,
"We regret that instead of a proper official clarification on the issue, the Foreign Secretary chose to threaten Russia with retribution. Looks like the script of yet another anti-Russian campaign has already been written."
But the Russians have acted before. Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned by the Russian state, an inquest ruled, and that case has ended up defining Anglo-Russian relations for the best part of a decade.
I think it's inevitable that people will suspect that Russia is involved. I mean, I and others, I think, are being very careful not to say that we are quite clear that this was the Russian state, authorized all the way to the top. We can't know that. But as I say, I think Russian protestations of innocence would be more convincing if there wasn't this long-term pattern of using this sort of poisoning as a way of getting at enemies of the state.
And in addition to the successful assassinations, there have been other attempts. In 2008, Newsnight reported that MI5 had stopped an attempt to kill exiled tycoon Boris Berezovsky.
This man came here to kill me, and my life is in danger.
In 2013, Mr. Berezovsky did die, though. Evidence pointed to suicide, though some believe more sinister explanations. And from our point of view, the earlier story about the assassination attempt on him had made us few friends.
When we ran the story saying that MI5 believed that Litvinenko had been killed by Russian intelligence and that they'd tried to kill Berezovsky as well, we came under considerable pressure. Whitehall officials tried to persuade us not to run the story. When we did, Downing Street disowned it, and the Russian media attacked us for trying to damage a reset in relations between Gordon Brown and then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. And what all that showed was the kind of conflict there is between those in the British government who want to counter illegal Russian state activity in this country and those who'd prefer business to carry on as usual.
The death of Russian businessman Alexander Perepelichny in 2012 in Surrey also produced allegations of foul play. The police were accused of failing to investigate properly and the government of wanting to avoid a row. But now there's the Skripal case, and if evidence of Russian involvement grows, it will mark a significant change in its relations with the UK.
It's an extraordinary, audacious choice of victim. It doesn't just break the rules, it's an entirely new game if they're doing this. Sergei Skripal was off the board. He wasn't in any sense a target. He was living under his own name. He'd been swapped out of Russia. He wasn't adopting any kind of public profile. So this is an absolutely brazen, full-on challenge to Britain if Russia is indeed behind this attempted murder.
But those factors don't make you doubt that it was some sort of Russian operation?
It's very hard to explain. If Russia is behind it, it means they're taking things to a whole new level. This is, in effect, a kind of declaration of war from the Russians to bump off someone like that if they did it. It makes me wonder whether it's for domestic consumption and they haven't thought through the foreign policy results. Do they really want to destroy relations with Britain and with the West generally? Because that's what will happen if it turns out this was a state-sponsored murder.
President Putin has declared foreign agents to be traitors who'll get their just desserts.
Traitors will kick the bucket, trust me.
Even referring to the man sent to assassinate Trotsky. Just rhetoric or state policy? The investigation in Wiltshire may soon give us an indication.
Mark Urban. Well, earlier I spoke to the Conservative MP Tom Tugendhat, chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Was Boris Johnson right to all but point the finger at the Russian state?
Well, look, I don't think he did on this particular incident, but what he did do is he pointed to a pattern, and he's absolutely right to do that, because there is a pattern. We've seen it in Montenegro, we've seen it in London with Litvinenko's murder. You know, we have seen this time and again, where Russian agents have gone to foreign countries and used murder as a means of state policy, and it's completely unacceptable.
So do you believe then that Russia was involved in this attack, if indeed it was an attack?
Well, I don't know at this stage, but all I'm saying is that it fits a pattern, and that raises enormous amounts of concern.
The Russian response today says it looks like the script of an anti-Russian campaign has already been written.
Well, look, the job of the Russian embassy is to defend the interests of the Russian state, including by dissimulating and using stories when the truth doesn't fit. And they have been very good at that over a number of years. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they're saying that sort of thing. But, you know, sometimes if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it might just be a duck. And in this case, we've got a poisoning, we've got a Russian former intelligence chief who defects to the West, and we've now got him and his daughter in a comatose state on a bench in Salisbury. It does somehow fit that pattern.
But do you think that, by and large, the UK has been soft on Russia and the people that get to come here?
Look, I think that one thing that the Foreign Secretary has been very clear on is the reality of Russian threatening behaviour, the malign influence, as he put it, of Moscow these past number of years. We've seen that influence, just by the way, in places like Georgia, where they've invaded, and we've seen it in Ukraine, where they've changed the European border by force for the first time since the Second World War by seizing Crimea, and we've seen it in our close ally Estonia, where they kidnapped an Estonian official a number of years ago and used cyber attacks on the economy in 2007. And so we have seen this pattern before. What we now need to see is a harsher, a more targeted response to Russian officials who are doing this. And we can do it. You know, this is why I'm so pleased that the government has passed the Magnitsky Act and could, in fact, do a little bit more to tighten it. I think that the Criminal Financing Act that is going through the Commons at the moment is a very important act. And I would like to see unexplained wealth orders, the sort of thing that are regularly used against ordinary criminals in the United Kingdom, used against oligarchs who are pawns of the Kremlin mafia regime. Part of the reason I called the urgent question in Parliament today was to give the Foreign Secretary the opportunity that he then very clearly took, which was to call out Russia for the malign influence that she has become in the world. And this is an absolute...
But the problem is then you have Boris Johnson, sound and fury signifying what? Removal of a couple of officials from the World Cup?
Well, look, that's why I'm calling on the government to do more. I'm calling on the government to use, as I say, unexplained wealth orders, to seize, to hit these guys where it hurts, in the bank balance, and to make sure that they cannot own property, they cannot move through our cities, that they cannot start buying up our assets, as they have been doing. But I think we can even go further. We've got 2 Russian propaganda channels which are operating from the United Kingdom, one based in Edinburgh. We need to be absolutely robust and make sure that they are absolutely complying with their Ofcom licenses, which somehow, given the way that they report, strikes me as extremely unlikely. And I think we need to be absolutely robust in making sure that the rules apply absolutely firmly to them.
Do you actually ban those stations?
Well, if we can prove that they are what they certainly seem to be, then yes, I think we should, because I see no reason why we should allow the propagation of information warfare, because that's actually what it is. I mean, I know it's politely called fake news. It isn't fake news, it's information warfare. We should call it what it is and we should stop it.
Going back very briefly to this case, have we let this man down?
I don't know the details of this case, so I'm afraid I can't comment on that. But what we must do is to make sure that if there is Russian state collusion in this, we must make sure that the response is absolutely clear and robust. And that may mean expelling some officials, it may mean sanctioning some individuals, but it should certainly mean making sure the United Kingdom is not able to be used by oligarchs and Kremlin lackeys to launder their stolen and ill-gotten gains.
Tom Tugendhat, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, we asked to speak to the Russian government, but no one was available. I'm now joined by Lord MacDonald QC, who was the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time of the Litvinenko murder, and Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, who was Security and Counter-Terrorism Minister under David Cameron when Theresa May was Home Secretary. Good evening to both of you. First of all, Ken MacDonald, when this happened in Salisbury, everybody automatically thought of Litvinenko. And then when you think how long it took to resolve the Litvinenko case, do you think the response of the UK government was wanting?
Well, it did take a long time. We at the CPS announced fairly quickly that we thought there was a strong prima facie case against Andrei Lugovoy and that he should be extradited from Russia to stand trial in London for the murder of Litvinenko. But it took quite a long time for the government to announce a independent judicial inquiry, which concluded not only that Lugovoy was responsible, but that a man called Dmitry Kovtun was too, and that it was a Russian state execution, which we had also strongly suspected and indicated that we suspected, and also that, in the view of Sir Robert, President Putin had almost certainly known about this execution. So it took a long time. We got there in the end. I hope that the inquiry into this case will be a little swifter in coming to conclusions, whatever those conclusions might be.
Well, Pauline Neville-Jones, you were a minister at the Home Office when Mrs. Litvinenko was trying to get justice. And as we just said there, it was a long time to get that inquiry. It was 7 years to get that inquiry. That is not a great result, is it?
No, it's not. It's not. And this time round, it has to be faster. There's no doubt about that.
But do you regret the fact that Mrs. Litvinenko had to spend all that time and pushing against Theresa May, of course, who refused to grant an inquiry?
Well, I mean, we should learn from past mistakes, and I think that whole proceeding, we have to do something faster and more conclusive. But I think what has now happened, and we must wait, obviously, to discover what has happened to this man. But I think we are now, I think, confronting a much bigger question about our relationship with Russia. And that is, I think, where government policy needs now to focus.
But BuzzFeed, the news service, plotted 14 different deaths, and as Mark Urban says, some may have been...
Some may, and some
may have
not.
been suspicious, some may have not been. But do you think in those cases that actually we didn't do enough to prioritise looking into those cases?
Well, I think I would want to take one by one, and in the absence of having done a work of that kind, I'm not prepared to pronounce on that. But what I do think is that we have a great deal of evidence now about our relationship with Russia, and indeed about Russia's behaviour towards the West.
And we need to reset that again.
We need to reset that.
I'll come on to that in a minute, but Ken MacDonald, on that point of those 14 possible cases of possible state involvement by the Russians, did we not actually take these seriously enough? Were we too happy to move very quickly to ideas that perhaps there was a suicide here, perhaps there was natural causes there? We didn't drill down for various reasons.
Well, these are 14 individual cases, and as Pauline has said, they have to be looked at individually. What we do know from the Litvinenko case is that the Russian state is perfectly capable of ordering the execution on British streets of British citizens who are under the protection of the British state by the foulest means. We know they're capable of that because they did it in the Litvinenko case. We'll have to see what the result of the toxicology test is here. But if, and it's a big if, but if it turns out that this man and his daughter were poisoned as a result of a direction from the Russian state, then that would indicate that the Russian state itself is crassly lawless, and it would mark a really catastrophic turn in our relations with Russia.
Of course, the Russians are denying any involvement,
Of
and
course,
actually
yeah.
recently President Putin talked about the fact that I think it was something like 400 spies were apprehended in Russia in 2017. So this is also a very dangerous business on both sides.
It's very dangerous, and that's why the response of the British government has to be particularly carefully calibrated. But we can't have foreign governments organising assassinations on British streets, particularly when the mechanism used is so dangerous to so many people and when the individuals being murdered are under the protection of our state. It's not possible for a state to retain its dignity and to permit that sort of conduct to take place without a very robust response.
Pauline Neville-Jones, you were Security and Counter-Terrorism Minister when the spy swap happened in 2010, essentially an American-Russian spy swap. Obviously, Mr. Skripal was involved in that swap because he was inserted by the British in the swap. There was a programme of protection, obviously, because that's what Mark Urban was talking about, but did we let him down?
Well, I mean, we'll have to look into that, and on the face of it, it would appear, that whatever the protection was, it wasn't adequate. Now, whether the indications of his security status were such as you didn't need to do what it would appear should have been necessary, what we now need to do, of course, is a full protection of an enhanced kind to anybody who may be in the same situation.
Very briefly, when Mark was talking to Edward Lucas said, if this is indeed a state-sponsored killing, then we are on a completely different footing with Russia, a footing that we've never been on before.
I wouldn't put it quite so dramatically, but I do think it marks a point where we actually do need to change policy. I really do think so. What we now have to do, and I think it's not something that the UK does by itself. I mean, what has happened here actually can happen in any European or indeed any democratic society. So we need now a long-term strategy of a kind that we haven't actually thought we needed really since the Cold War. And we need something where we put the proposition to the Russians. On the one hand, we are going to defend and we are going to deter you. And on the other hand, we will engage on conditions. And we need to actually formulate that as Europeans and with the hope of the Americans.
Thank you, Pauline Neville-Jones. Thank you, Ken MacDonald.
So, Times columnist Melanie Phillips, editor of politics.co.uk, Ian Dunt, both here. And once again, it's almost a clean sweep, isn't it, of this Russian spy story with various takes on it. The Daily Telegraph, to start with, then, that Putin swore revenge. What's the word they use? 30 pieces of silver, that traitors would choke on them.
Indeed.
Well, it does look more and more as if it is a state-sponsored assassination attempt by Putin's Russia. We have the remarks made, or the threats made by Putin. And, you know, our establishment seems to believe that there is something, that this is likely to be the case. We can see, you know, counter-terrorism involved, MI5 involved, Porton Down involved. A lot of conflicting stories about the details, not surprising, since so much of it we just don't know. Conflicting stories about, you know, if this couple were poisoned, was his drink spiked in the restaurant, where he was seen to be behaving slightly oddly, being very bad-tempered about the service. Well, maybe that was just one of those normal sorts of things. But then there's a story, then there are reports in various papers, like The Times, that up to 10 people in the surrounding area were somehow affected by this, with respiratory problems, itchy eyes, lending some credence to one suggestion that he may have been sprayed with some sort of poisonous substance. All of this is in the realm of conjecture. We just don't know. But it does look as if, once again, Britain's public spaces have been used for a Russian-based assassination attempt.
And a spray as a means of delivery would explain why his daughter, Yulia, who seems to have been visiting from Moscow, was also hit. And she is the innocent, I suppose, in all of this, isn't she?
I think she lives here.
Right,
I think that she's lived here since 2010. I'm not... health warning on that, because I've only just read it. But I think that she lives here. That could have been when she was trying to help him, of course.
We don't know.
What we do know is that we know where the tents are, where the police tents are. We know they've closed the Zizis, where they definitely ate. Some newspapers are suggesting that they had a drink in a pub called The Mill, which is nearby, and there's certainly tents around that area. And The Sun seems to be suggesting, I can't remember the name of the substance, that something was put in his pint in that pub, or that the police fear that that might be the case. That is not what's been suggested elsewhere. The Mail's take seems to be a suggestion, and they're being quite careful with all of this, but nevertheless the suggestion is that someone basically came up to him in the street and sprayed him with this thing, which then would explain, as you were saying, you know, the effect on the eyes, the effect on the throats, people who were nearby, or the emergency workers who came, possibly also the daughter, who would be collateral damage in this assessment, rather than a specific target in and of herself. All of this is better than conjecture. I mean, it's based on sort of eyewitness reports that are there, or on people talking to the police, but nevertheless, it has a massive health warning all over it. We obviously, at this very early stage, don't really know the details.
Indeed so. And the implications of this now are what, in terms of the British government and its response? We have a Cobra committee meeting on Wednesday morning. Boris Johnson has already been called to the House of Commons and got himself in a bit of a pickle, did he?
Not a great day for Boris Johnson, and it very rarely is when these very big moments arrive. It has to be said. I mean, you know, you go back when he was London mayor to the riots. If you remember back then, there was days of terrible coverage of his response to it. He very much struggles to live up to moments that require a bit of gravitas and also some precise use of language. So a couple of mistakes that he made today. The first one was basically saying the English football team would not go to the World Cup in Russia.
Which is the Mail's... I mean, a number of newspapers have gone on this line, haven't they?
I have to say that the newspapers have broadly, at least on the front pages, not been too critical. Some of the detail inside has been a bit more critical. Nevertheless, you would hope that he could be precise about precisely what the penalty is that he's suggesting. The second part is that he seemed to sort of suggest that this was an act of war and that cyber attacks are an act of war, which is the kind of language that you really need to stay very, very clear of in this quite frenzied scenario, because, of course, what it suggests when the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain and Northern Ireland says that about a country is that you're at war with Russia, which is not where we are right now, and certainly not before the end of this investigation, and almost certainly not after it either. So, again, it's just one of those situations where someone who was put in that position for internal political manoeuvring reasons is now there using the fact that his mouth works before his brain works, in a situation where that really should not be the case.
Well, I agree, and, you know, one has to avoid the sort of frenzy that you are suggesting is building, and that the Foreign Secretary may have unwittingly given some willy to. But if it is the case that Russia was involved in a state assassination attempt, then the kind of penalties that are being discussed, withdrawal of dignitaries such as Prince William and other officials from the Olympic Games in Moscow, is pathetic. Because, you know, Putin is hardly going to take any notice of that. And I think much more condign response is required. I mean, in my view, you know, right from the murder of Litvinenko, which was the first radioactive poisoning carried out on Britain's streets, after a lot of fuss to begin with, everything settled down as normal, and Russians continue to pour in and buy up large parts of Britain and, you know, pour in vast amounts of money. And there is a feeling, I think, that Britain, you know, did not want to acknowledge the full gravity of the situation, either because they're frightened of taking on Russia for geopolitical reasons, or because they were frightened of doing anything to jeopardize this incredibly valuable money pot that Russia has become in recent years for Britain. And it's even more striking considering, as the Mail has a spread, which is interesting, on its inside pages, it lists 12 suspicious deaths of Russians in Britain, which were one might suspect were carried out by Russian hitmen. They've been put down variously to suicide, unexplained causes, natural causes. But, you know, it is a bit odd. I mean, you know, a property developer who's found impaled on railings 4 floors below his luxury flat apparently committed suicide. He was a close friend of Boris Berezovsky, who was granted asylum here after he fell out with Putin. And Berezovsky himself was found dead in the sauna in 2013, having supposedly hanged himself with a towel from the taps on his bath. Well, maybe he did. And here is Alexander Perepelichny, who died in Surrey in 2012. He'd fallen foul of the Kremlin. He fled to Britain, and he agreed to give evidence to a British businessman named Bill Browder, who was investigating a huge Russian tax scam. Browder's lawyer was murdered, says Browder. Browder has been all over the media in the last 24 hours saying, well, of course this was a Russian hit. I am, you know, on the hit list. My lawyer was murdered. You know, this is going on all the time in Britain. Now, if this is true, then it means that the British have been just turning a blind eye to something which should have met with the most condign response a long time ago.
Yeah, so we need to be careful because we don't know. But absolutely, the picture that's emerging...
the Home Affairs Select Committee are starting to urge the government to look into some of these cases.
That's exactly right. So Yvette Cooper today wrote on behalf of the Home Affairs Select Committee to Amber Rudd. That would be trying to ramp up where we are with this. I mean, these allegations on the 14 comes from a BuzzFeed investigation that they got from some kind of US intelligence source. There is also a spreading out in terms of Scotland Yard seems to be investigating the deaths of his wife and children at various points.
Skripal,
exactly, yeah. Who seem to have died sort of just unexpected, and there's an awful lot of rumours around those deaths as well. So there's a spreading out all over the place, and the fear is exactly the story that you've told, which is basically of British authorities being too cowardly, too nervous to actually take the steps that were required as a result of this. Probably really stemming from the Litvinenko case.
Berezovsky, for example, there was an inquest and it returned an open verdict. So these things have been... It's not like they haven't been investigated, some of these.
They have. There's also an awful lot of stories of the police coming to the same conclusion over and over again. Look, we don't know what that is yet. We don't know whether any of this is true. It could be that absolutely every single one of those deaths really was from natural causes, or the guy slipped off his balcony and did fall on you know, the fence or whatever.
It could be.
Of course, that's perfectly possible.
crime-related. I mean, we've seen McMafia now, haven't we? We've seen how these things might work.
Indeed.
It doesn't necessarily need to be state-sponsored in that.
That's true, but it is not.
Sense.
It is not hysterical to say that Russia has quite an active programme of trying to destabilise and take advantage of Western powers. It is not hysterical to point out, as the Telegraph does on its front page today, that Putin is on the record as saying that these guys who worked as secret agents for the British against their Russian sort of colleagues should be killed, because that is what he said. So given the fact that it has come from his mouth, it does not seem unreasonable for us to think that that might be something that he would pursue. Remember, he is former KGB himself and hardly keeps any of this stuff secret. So look, this is not hysteria. People try to move assessing it as cautiously as possible, and it is healthy and good that the political system is now starting to get a little bit more robust, a little bit more kick into it about investigating these things. We can only hope that most of them don't turn out to be true.
And the Daily Mail front page as well, showing his daughter again, Yulia, suggested that he appeared to criticise Russia's president online. So maybe she isn't collateral damage. I mean, there are so many questions now, aren't there, in terms of this investigation?
There are a lot of questions. We simply don't know, I'm afraid.
She didn't write much, did she? I mean, basically someone said something on Facebook and she went, "That's right," or something like that. I mean, which is the kind of... I mean, if you're someone whose father has had to flee from Russia because of a president, there's a really good chance that you are going to say that kind of thing on Facebook where people share political opinions all the time. Okay. So one can conclude too much from that. But yes, absolutely, that's in a couple of newspapers.
Yeah,
it may or may not be present.
So we wait for toxicology. We see where the investigation takes us. There are a number of scenes now being investigated in Wiltshire. It's an active investigation, and the pressure is on the government to try and come up with some sort of diplomatic solution, I suppose, to the pressure from President Putin.
And to conduct itself in a measured but firm tone.